what I want to talk about today is not ethics. I know I advertised ethics, but I'd like to, maybe we could get to that in the Q&A. I think there are ethical implications to the conversations about the Anthropocene, which hinge on its politics and economics. And instead, what I want to do is just talk you through two case studies, some older work and some fresh work, trying to draw some lessons about what we now refer to as the Anthropocene, which, of course, like 5 years ago, you'd get up in front of an audience and you'd use this word and people would be befuddled. Like, what is this neologism? And now, it trips off the tongue. Everybody, it's a very improbable word, and everybody uses it without actually ever properly defining it, and there's a good reason. Nobody knows what it means, right? Stratigraphers were sitting in a working group arguing about when it started. And think about that. Did it start in 1950? Did it start in 1800? Did it start 10,000 years ago? These stratigraphers asking essentially civilizational, political economy questions. And if you look at the list, none among them trained probably the way you are, which is a crying shame. So I'm going to give you a very simple definition of the Anthropocene, and I'm going to then ask, what does it mean in terms of politics and economics with its ethical implications? And the definition, as you can imagine from the title, is pretty simple. Irreversibility. Irreversibility. Ecological changes at the global scale, which no matter what you do, you can't undo. You can't unstir the honey from your tea. And that condition of irreversibility challenges in a fundamental way most of our considerations of ecology, some of our considerations of politics, and certainly lots of our considerations of ethics. And what do I mean by irreversibility? Wow, it's better that way maybe. If you want to snooze a little. So that includes, that is the smallest font you're going to see. I promise not to do that to you twice. Irreversibility. That means climate change, it's built, we got 2 to 3 degrees of climate change built into the system. Yeah, that's better. 2 to 3 degrees, because I need to see. 2 to 3 degrees built into the system. If you were to stop emitting fossil fuels right now, it'd still get 2 degrees warmer for 100 years, maybe 3. I can't imagine what the world would look like at 4 degrees. There is no going back, right? Ecological novelty, I'm going to talk about a lot here. That is simply the encounter of species that had never encountered one another before to create new kinds of ecosystem outcomes. That's a whole field of study. It didn't even exist 15 years ago. There's no going, you can't disentangle these ecosystems. They only go forward, right? Altered geomorphology, altered biogeochemistry, there is no going back. Irreversibility. I'm going to give you 2 cases or examples of ecosystems that have transformed or been transformed in the Anthropocene in India. And I'm going to ask how you interpret them and what they might mean about a condition that is different than an ecology that we thought about in the 1970s and 80s when I was coming into these fields, where you thought that if you just took your hand back off the system, if people would just go away, if capitalism would just go away, everything would get back to where it ought to be, which was, 1491, I suppose. If we jettison that, what are we left with? Because that is where we are. Whatever's left is where we are and where we're going. Okay. Oh, and how you feel about that is not something I want to talk about in this talk, but it's actually where most of my research is going, is essentially, I guess you'd call it critical psychoanalysis of scientists. How do you feel about that fact that you can't go back is actually a hugely divisive problem. You have a whole range of conservation biologists, for example, who, when they see this, their immediate response, right, is despair. Violent despair and paralysis and mourning. It's like those stages of dealing with death, right? You begin with denial and then move into some kind of phase of mourning. Whereas there are people out there who say, hey, we can live with this. We can move, we have to live with this. This could actually be good. This is a book by Emma Morris called Rambunctious Garden. She's a journalist, but she basically interviews scientists who are coming to terms with that forward-moving, as I will argue, dialectical, spinning forward process of the Anthropocene. So she's fairly optimistic. These people yell at each other a lot. They literally yell at each other in meetings. I mean, it was like the AG was back in the early 1990s, everybody shouting at Julie Graham. So my point here is how you feel about this, I'll leave to you. How you feel about this, that's your own business. You may worship your own God. But I want to know what it means for the politics, economics, and ecology of these regions. So 2 case studies. First case study is here. It is in Rajasthan, some earlier work. It's in fact at the Kumbhalgarh Wildlife Sanctuary, which is in the southern part of the state. You see this area straddles the 500 millimeter isohyet, so stinking desert here, pissing rain here. It's this really fecund space right along this line ecologically. A very productive and biodiverse area. One of the last breeding sites of the Indian wolf. Also a site where panthers are being protected, so the sanctuary is here. Now, is it a natural environment? It's about 9 kilometers thick and about 300 kilometers long. It's not like people aren't touching this landscape. And of course the touching goes way back, right? You can get some sense of it here. This does not work. But you can get some sense of it. The sanctuary follows the line of the Aravalli Hills here. All right? And it's not like nobody's ever touched this landscape before. I mean, all the way back to 1887, subsistence in these forests were criminalized by colonial code, which means people were already using the forest. And as soon as those people were thrown off the land, colonial foresters conducted industrial forestry for the first half of the century, and then contract forestry followed independence. This place has been hammered, transformed. It is a fundamentally humanized environment. There are species that no longer exist in this space, but as of 2000, it's exclusively a reserve for wildlife. And it becomes, it can't be wilderness, right? But it can at least be wild. So the idea here is a sanctuary, but it is a transformed landscape. On the other hand, it's got a lot of wild stuff in it, right? That's the Indian wolf. You get migratory waterfowl that are coming from all the way from Siberia down to Sri Lanka. They pass right through the reserve, which is a really important choke point on a lot of their migrations. That's all kinds of interesting raptors. That's the crested serpent eagle, the Hanuman langur monkey, of course, all kinds of lizardy things. I'm not a conservation biologist. So it's got nature, there's nature in here, right? There's a lot of nature. But of course it abuts very dense, productive, capitalized agricultural systems that literally run right up against the hills here, and the landscape is used. And so the question we asked, a group of us asked, is what kinds of ecologies do you get when you have a humanized environment and a highly politicized protection conservation regime? So that was sort of the broad question. And the first question is, are people using the forest? Even though it's totally illegal, right? And the answer is, yeah, of course they are. You don't have to be especially familiar with South Asian forestry to understand what's going on here. Thousands of sheep illegally enter the reserve every day. People are extracting materials by the headload as cattle fodder, especially for buffalo. Coppicing of trees, which is a very traditional way of feeding livestock, and there is a certain amount of timber extraction, right? So people are using the forest; it's getting churned up, right? So this should be very worrisome. And how do they get access to this? How do they get access to this? And the answer is they pay gatekeepers for access to the forest. This is again uncontroversial. I mean, it's controversial, I suppose, but it should be unsurprising. It's not rocket surgery, right? This is a land rent system where lower-level forest officers are paid for access. And the reason the lower-level forest officers take those bribes is partly has to do with their wage rate, which is extremely low, and partly because they're obligated to hit quotas of certain levels of money that pass up through the forest department and essentially, it's like DDT sort of slowly finding its way into the fat cells of predators at the top of the system, right? All of this money sort of flows up in land rents from the landscape, and because many of these guys, and they're all guys, are locals, and when you ask them, why do you let people into the forest, their answer is quite reasonable. Where else would the cattle graze, they explain, and I thought that's a very compelling answer, actually. So in that sense, you've got a very complicated micro-political economy, which I don't have time to document at length, but that is what's controlling the metabolism. That is the Anthropocene lever on this landscape. And so if you enter this landscape and you say to yourself, has the ecosystem been destroyed, right? Because you would think it would go badly for the forest with all that use. And the use rates are very, very high. And the answer is, yeah, it depends on where you go, of course. You walk along a path, you find yourself here. What do you see? You see invasive species, you see heavy levels of coppicing, a lot of the trees are removed, the canopy's opening up. This is you're getting a novel ecosystem here, a new set of interactions, right? Other places, however, this is like the Blair Witch movie, right? It's about 15 years of secondary succession. So areas are growing back. There are all kinds of new things coming up. Will this forest, even where it's growing back, look anything like the forest that was there in 1885 before the British came? Or 1,000 years prior? You can go back to the Vedas and find deforestation, right? No, and the answer is no. It will be something different. It will be an entirely new and rambunctious garden. Right? Now what's interesting about this is that this photo was taken from the exact same place as this photo, just on two sides of the path. So what is also happening in this forest is that these gentlemen are silently managing where people go and where they don't go, allowing them more or less access to different areas of the forest. So the whole patchwork of the ecology is, again, managed through a system of complex, illegal land rents that produces different kinds of ecologies. All right? And this last player here has dominated the landscape almost everywhere where the canopy's opened up. And this is Lantana camera. Is anybody familiar with this little thing? I think it's a New World non-domesticate. It's an ornamental, and it is poisonous and rapid growing, and it loves the sunlight, and it's thick-rooted. Trying to remove these bushes where I lived in Tucson is a nightmare. There's no going back on this one. Whole hillsides are covered with Lantana camera. And so there's reason for mourning. If I'm a conservation biologist, I should go into mourning. Because what we're seeing is a system from which there is no going back. This is from Richard Hobbs' very famous paper, in Trends in Ecology and Evolution. All he's saying here is that if you have a system that historically behaves in a particular way, an ecosystem, and you create abiotic conditions like climate change, or biotic composition like new invasive species or cutting things apart, you're going to make it change into something else, right? Move it out of its historical system. And in some cases, if you take your hands off the system, it goes back. If climate change stopped, it would go back. If the invasive species were eradicated, it would go back. But in most cases, there are barriers to return. And as such, restoration of a historic system is not feasible. It's almost difficult or impossible to get back. So now we're freaked out, right? Because if what we're trying to protect are wolves and panthers, which I think is a very laudable conservation goal, by the way. I like charismatic fauna like the next white guy. What you need, right, are herbivores and lumber monkeys to feast upon, and they need arboreal and ground cover resources, which is exactly what's getting, right, hammered through this system of illicit land rents. Livestock are eating your ground cover, invasive species are replacing these kinds of things, you're cutting the arboreal resources, Lantana camera is making a mess of things, right? And if you put the stress on the bottom, in terms of trophic cascades, as they're called in ecology, you're going to wind up with a lot of dead animals. That's the deal, right? So do we get dead animals? The answer is no. This is a short time series. This does not come from the Forest Department, because if it did, I would tell you not to believe it. These are data overseen by Anil Changani, one of my co-PIs from Rajasthan. And what you're seeing over this fairly short time horizon is increases in population in most of the species of concern. The wolf is going down. We'll come back to that. Panthers are doing just fine. I'll try to make this short. Why are they doing well? Here's the blue bull, locally called Rouge. I have a theory that when the British came, they didn't want to use the Deshi local name, so they called it a blue bull, which then got translated back as Neil Guy, which means blue cow. It is sacred. And it's also like an animal developed by committee. It's an antelope about the size of a horse. It's a remarkable fellow. And it is thriving if you go through its scat, which we have, and gone through all the poo. What you find is people's crops, right? So it is thriving essentially on resources from outside the forest. If you're driving a motorcycle along the edge of the forest at nightfall, you will see whole groups of them coming out of the forest from the day and out into the fully anthropogenic landscapes of the farms. The langur monkey, also, there's some dips here, but for the most part, the trajectory is high. Why? There's two reasons. One, it somehow manages to eat Lantana camera. So it's thriving on Lantana camera, the poisonous species that would destroy the landscape. is actually been wedged into the trophic system in a way that was entirely unpredictable. And the second reason, right, is they're just bloody smart, these animals. This is what the first power line that came through the reserve in the 1990s. This is night roosting behavior. They get up in these trees because they don't want to be eaten by leopards. There's no leopard that is going to climb this power line. Whether cancer rates or whatever go up in the monkey population is another question. But this is an animal that's, the animals that are no longer around have been squeezed through the extinction filter. These guys are doing just fine, right? And then when you look at the leopard populations, which are booming, right? These are the ones we wanted to protect by throwing all these people out of the forest. Let's come back to the story. The story is, the Supreme Court says, get everybody out of the forest so that the animals can come back in an area heavily used. The populations are rising. And when you go through their scat, what do you think you find? You're going through the poo, what do you find? Any guesses? Some blue bull, they're a little big to take down. Monkeys, sheep. Right? Thousands of sheep are entering this forest every day. And of course, the herders don't complain that they lose 1 out of 100 sheep or 1 out of 1,000 sheep every month because they're in there illegally in the first place. Right? The leopard is thriving. The wolf, on the other hand, is going down, and there's a reason for that. Cats and dogs don't get along. Where leopards thrive, wolves cannot. The fact that both of them are there is because the last tiger was shot in 1952. This is a chaotic system, but it behaves by Anthropocene rules governed by a micropolitical economy. So what we're supposed to get, right, are big things eating littler things, eating grass, all wild. You're getting wild predators thriving on domesticated species that live on wild ground covers, as well as local and indigenous wild species thriving on, right, anthropogenic land uses. This is the cross subsidies of this system. Ungoverned, except by a handful of foresters taking bribes. That's the governing system of the Anthropocene. So, this is a definition of nodal ecosystems. Don't worry about it. This is just to say there's a whole separate science about this. So, what name do we give this? And I've hunted around for a name for a long time. On the far side of the Aravalli here, what you're seeing is this is a vehicle that hauls marble. That is a tube well engine pulled from an agricultural farm nearby, an old truck chassis, a converted set of wood from an old house. It basically cobbled together, and it's a heavy lifting vehicle. And locally, it's called jugar, or jugaru. That's the name of the vehicle. And that translates essentially, and you can check my translation, as coming to an understanding, coming to an agreement, like the end of a bargain, right? Working it out. That is the perfect metaphor for the Indian Anthropocene, at least at Kumbhalgarh, right? So if I could just make some lessons that we can draw more generally outside of the Indian context, we're seeing negotiated access rights, mutual coercion, because the foresters can't control the population any more than the population can control the foresters, by the way. Illicit land rents are creating new ecological, socio-ecological relationships. Then they reflect a lot of opportunities for non-human actors. Those panthers are taking full advantage of the micropolitical economy, right? So at a more general level, the changing micropolitics of control and access are going to rewrite those irreversible Anthropocene landscapes, and those in turn drive the conditions for future economy and biodiversity. They just spin forward. The changes go, the ratchet is turned, it cannot be unratcheted. That's Ruth de Vries's metaphor, the big ratchet. And then you cope with the existing system to feed yourself, to thrive as a monkey, and you go through that process and you actually reproduce and spread more lantana camera seeds, and you ratchet the system further. That is the Anthropocene. It is not a system out of control, it is a system in control, but in ways that can't be controlled. Second case. If I picked you up at the Bangalore airport in a helicopter, I'm into dirigibles right now. The Canadian government's got actually mining companies have these dirigibles that they're going to go up into the northern part of the country to mine with, by the way. Did you see that in the paper? I love dirigibles. Okay. I'm putting you in a dirigible, and I'm flying you west over the Western Ghats, the hills that essentially line the fringe of the southwest part of the country, and I drop you. If I just drop you out of the dirigible and you land safely at a random location, you're going to see a pretty dense, complex forest, a lot of endemic species. That means species that are found only locally, right? Important endemic species, complex layers to the canopy. You are very likely to see wild animals of all kinds, wild birds, migratory and otherwise, frogs, as I will show you, a lot of biodiversity, right? But if you look at your feet, statistically, you're not most likely, but you're very likely, if I randomly dropped you in this region, particularly in Karnataka, to see that at your feet. This, kind of very big. And that, of course, is, yeah, that's coffee. So, right? So, thousands of square kilometers of coffee, thousands of square kilometers of rubber, thousands of square kilometers of areca nut, right, which is pounded, chewed, spat to give you a head buzz. These are the landscapes mostly of the Western Ghats. There are some very important tiger parks, and there are some very important conservation areas, but most of the landscape, right, is under cultivation and production. It is hammered by the hands of people. And where did the coffee come from? Did it suddenly appear in 1947? No, the keys to the coffee plantations were turned over from wealthy white people to wealthy brown people right around 1945, right? So these are coffee plantations that have been here for a very long time. Rubber plantations are a little newer, areca nut sort of mixed, but that's the landscape where you're seeing this diversity. So the question we had to ask was, do you really get biodiversity? Is it really biodiverse? Are these landscapes really biodiverse? These Anthropocene landscapes, are they actually biodiverse or just look that way from the outside? And two, are they all biodiverse? And if they're not all biodiverse, some of them are biodiverse and some of them aren't. What are the political, economic, or other kinds of conditions that produce those outcomes? It's not that different than Kumulgar. What are the levers of rent-seeking or political practice or whatever it is that give you frogs here and not frogs there? This is a very practical question if you're a conservation head and you were interested in rare frogs. Because you need to know why farmers would produce conditions that produce frogs. Because they're not farming frogs. Right? They're farming an international, highly capitalized cash crop. Although coffee exports are going down, coffee production is up because the Indian middle class is drinking more coffee. Rubber production, up. Now, this mystified me. Rubber production from trees. I figured we have science for that, right? Science rubber. Don't we have machines that make rubber, right? And the answer actually is globally, rubber production is up. And there's a couple reasons for it. One is the highly variable cost of the inputs to industrial rubber, which the main input to production is obviously petroleum. And as such, the smoothness of rubber production from rubber tapping is actually a very attractive investment curve over time. And the second reason is natural rubber is actually much more useful in certain forms of production than industrially produced rubber, like tire manufacturing. And the point is, these are viable, capitalized landscapes. People are making money. They're exporting stuff. So these are my collaborators. I don't want to say much about them except to say that they're both academics of Indian origin who had tenure or tenure-track positions in the United States and who moved back to India, which deserves a whole nother paper. So here we are. This is the Western Ghats here. It's this fringe. This is the state of Karnataka. You can see it's this area here in red is considered the Ghats. It runs this whole range. It has probably a 30% of the biodiversity of India itself, so it is one of the most diverse spaces. And it's heavily forested, but under that canopy, right, there's a lot of coffee. And here's sort of the area where we're working. As I said, 3,200 square kilometers of coffee in the area, 5,000 square kilometers of rubber. This is a going concern, all right? And the holding sizes vary. You have big macro sites with more than 100 hectares. That's a big operation. And you get these tiny little 2-hectare family. They're all family operations, but they operate at very different scales with different labor demand. Come back to that. This is what it looks like under the canopy of a coffee plantation. It can be diverse. This one isn't particularly. This is silver oak in the trees here. These are all brought by the British. These are not native or endemic to the Ghats. And then the coffee plantation sort of rises up underneath it. You can see that this is coppiced and managed very, very closely. This is a labor-intensive system. You need a lot of workers. Again, I'll come back to that. This is what rubber looks like. I'm not going to talk too much about rubber, but I fell in love with rubber production. It is much, much more complex an ecosystem than we had imagined. All of this is hand-dried. This latex is then put on a motorcycle, and it winds up in the regional and then global markets. And this is areca nut. It looks very orderly, but in fact, it has a very disordered canopy, which is extremely good, as we found, for birds. But just in terms of coffee, there we are again. Don't worry about this. This is political ecology. So boxes and arrows, very boring mechanistic models that are ill-suited to the kinds of ecosystems I'm talking about. It is time to get rid of political ecology, right? We're way outside. But the idea here is that diversity is governed by the simplicity or complexity of cropping activities on the part of farmers, and those farmers are responding to something in the political economy which makes them do stuff. So big things make small things happen, very old school political ecology. Still works, clunky, but it works. 300 sites were sampled ecologically, and 1,000 plantations we visited and talked with farmers and interviewed them about their production systems all through this region. And then we went out and we counted birds. For those of you who are interested in this stuff, I'm fascinated. I learned how to do this. You enter the plantation here at a site, then you run a series of orthogonal samples, and then you sample each site 6 times, and you sample per point 7 minutes, dawn and dusk, 3 days in a row. It's incredibly time-consuming and laborious, and you don't do it by eye, you do it by ear. So you have to hire people who recognize all the birds. For the most part, a lot of them are local folks who were deeply invested in this project for reasons entirely of their own. But they are flawless and remarkable scholars of the forest. And then we had volunteers and interns who were working. This is one of the farmers. They're very curious about our findings. As you can imagine, if they think we're going to find biodiversity, they're terrified that the Indian government's going to turn them into a park. It's not that different than Montana. And it's not an entirely ill-founded terror, by the way. But nonetheless, they were working with us and cooperating under the assumption that we would turn over the bird species counts to them along with pictures that they can use in their part-time business, which is homestays, essentially ecotourism, where they make a whole lot more money than they do from coffee. All right, so they're out there, they're counting. What do we find? They do other ecological stuff, survey stuff. They found a lot of birds. The wealth of biodiversity, I'm not going to put any numbers in front of you, is remarkable. How does it compare to the wild plant, the sort of conservation areas? Quite favorably. It is not the same. It is a different ecosystem, so you get different assemblages of birds. The same thing, there's lots of these. Some of them are ubiquitous species like the hill myna, but some of them like the Malabar barbet, much more unusual. These are important. The point is they're important ecosystems. And this just says we counted. Okay? And did some math. And a lot of corrections, which I don't even understand. Amphibian sampling, as it turns out, is a whole lot harder. The literature is not very good on it. And just to give you a feeling of what you have to do, you've got to go to the plantation. You're climbing a 45-degree hill slope. You're stopping and you're listening again for frog call. Except it's trickier because it's the middle of the night, in the middle of the monsoon, and it's raining like it's raining. And that's why we have graduate students who most of this, and they recognize the frogs by. I mean, it's funny and it's not funny. It's exploited labor. We can talk about that too. I know you enjoy talking about it. I can talk about. If you want to talk about the budget model, we can talk about that. But for now, let's talk about frogs. Do we find frogs? I am so in love with amphibians right now. We are finding gliding frogs that practically fly. You are looking at frogs that secrete mucus to regulate moisture loss on drier trees, right, as opposed to ones that thrive on wet trees. This is the smallest frog in India. We find these in the thousands in ponds on rubber plantations where they really shouldn't be, right? There's that. And this is the key find. This one actually was new. This species was new to science as of 2008, and it's critically endangered. And here it is, living and thriving precisely in the most humanized of all the landscapes of the Ghats. So something's going on here that's producing birds and frogs. I can't get into all the details of it, but what you try to figure out is the degree to which the canopy is preserved, because some of these farms have denser canopy and some of them are more open. Is it because of various ground covers that are put into the farm, right? There are all kinds of things that people are doing, tinkering. Farmers are super smart, right? They're tinkering with the landscape. And then one of the most important is species diversity of the trees. And I'll just stick with that one for now. You can see this is a non-diverse coffee landscape, mostly silver oak. Here is a coffee plantation just down the road that has all kinds of native species, native diversity, and it tends to be, as it turns out, more diverse for birds. It's not surprising, right? Again, not rocket surgery. Where you have greater diversity, you're going to get more birds, okay? So that just is a diagram that says that. So then you have to ask the question, all right, you're a bird-friendly place, and you're not. What is it that makes this farmer different than that farmer? Who are the farmers that are maintaining, just for now let's ask the question, that are maintaining the most tree diversity on their land? Who are they? Here are some of the farmers we spoke to. Some of them have master's degrees in agronomy. Some of them do not have grade 8 education. The one thing that does not explain variability in production systems is education. Education makes no significant difference in 1,000 sampled farms about what people do. They are responding to something other than some textbook that tells people how to farm. All right? Something else is going on here. Once again, I would stress that education is really not very useful. When you talk to them, they all say the same thing. Particularly the ones who keep the biodiversity. They all say the same thing. Or the ones who change, I got it backwards. The ones who are removing biodiversity from the landscape and pulling the trees out, right? Pulling the trees out, sticking with silver oak, simplifying the landscape, decreasing the bird diversity. They all say the same thing. Lazy workers. Back in my father's day, workers knew how to work. Now they want coffee breaks, they want cigarette breaks, they want electricity, they're living on these plantations without electricity, right? It is a feudal labor system. There's some migrant labor as well. It's a very complex landscape. But the point is, labor's getting uppity. And when labor pushes back and demands higher wages and demands cigarette breaks, you simply pull the labor out and you simplify the system so you need less of it. And those are the largest plantation owners who are threatened, right, with a system that has essentially been subsidized by cheap labor since the colonial era. Those colonial farms that were turned over to Indian farmers, the labor system didn't change. As long as cheap wage labor was available, you could keep an extensive bird-friendly system. When labor pushes back and the wages rise, you have a problem for biodiversity. So unlike anything you would say in what all the romantic political ecologists in us want to believe, is that what's good for workers is good for birds. And I am here to tell you that is not true. Because what's good for workers has been rising wages. And why are the wages rising? Urban migration, massive urban migration in South India, right? International labor migration, people going to the United Arab Emirates, elsewhere. An entire labor force on the move. And the other part is many of these workers simply weren't born. The fertility rate in Karnataka is 1.8. In all of South India, it's below the replacement rate of 2. Population is shrinking throughout South India, and it's shrinking in Vietnam, and it's shrinking in Tunisia, and it's half the countries in the world report fertility rates below replacement. A radical Anthropocene transformation that nobody controlled, and it wasn't controlled by Indira Gandhi sterilizing the hell out of people in 1977. It came from the availability of rural health care. It came from birth control on demand. It came from women's employment rates rising and the opportunity costs of bearing children rising. The world is transformed, and it's not going back. It's irreversible. It's Anthropocenic. You see what I'm saying? All of these things are churning forward in unpredictable and uncontrollable ways that are, of course, somehow controlled. So that's just to say something about choosing between different varieties of coffee. That's another one of the drivers of these things. If you switch from one variety to the other, you impact diversity. That's the wage rates. These are the picking rates across India. Karnataka follows very closely. What you'll see is, up until 2006, they're fairly flat. And if you look at the labor force participation in this sector, it's when it was rising the fastest. This is not very complicated. Where labor is available, wage rates stay down. When labor becomes rare, that is, it tops out, the number of rural workers actually top out throughout the country, and especially in Karnataka in the south, and dip a little bit, the wage rates go through the roof. And this is what farmers are responding to. This, before anything else, before the price of coffee or the price of rubber, before the price of inputs, they're responding to the aspirations of rural people who do not want to pick frickin' coffee. And there they are. It is a laborious and backbreaking business, and some of the people we talked to would have preferred to be a security guard in a mall than to be picking coffee, right? Not to say that life in Bangalore, by the way, is some kind of tea party, okay? I'm just saying people are voting with their feet. Workers are voting with their feet. So that's what I just said. Labor matters. Demographic shifts are happening. I will summarize the lessons from number 2. 1, in the specific case, there's been a persistence of smallholder commodity producers in global export crops because of legacy labor-power relations. What kept things from changing most dramatically is surplus labor in the system. This is almost modernization theory. For those of you who want to critique it, feel free to do so after I'm gone. And really a deferral of the contradictions left over from legacy colonial economics. That's probably a good, more Marxist way of reading this, right? That those labor contradictions were always there, but they're announcing themselves after being long deferred, in a sense. Labor bargaining power has shifted a drive of displacement, an exchange of nature for labor power. So in other words, if you can't cheat workers, you're going to have to cheat the birds. It's one or the other. And that's really the take-home on this. The more universal finding, leaving India out of this, is that these irreversible ecologies hinge on equally irreversible economic and demographic shifts, which in turn rewrite the landscapes on which those things are played out. And there's no going back. That the future is just going to look different. And every time it gets different, it's going to get different again. So is that really new? Last philosophical question. Hasn't that always been the case? I mean, didn't Engels have it essentially right in 1886 in defining dialectics? Isn't this what we already saw? Essentially, dialectics reveals the transitory character of everything and in everything, and nothing can endure before it except the uninterrupted process of becoming and of passing away. It's almost Harawaiian. Everybody should go pick up the Harawaiian genius, Frederick Engels. Dialectical philosophy itself is nothing more, and I want to hit this last point. Dialectical philosophy itself is nothing more than the mere reflection of this process in the thinking of the brain. So thinking dialectically is itself a process of emerging dialectical relationships. So the Anthropocene, if we're Frederick Engels, is not a new condition for the earth or a new condition for humanity. It is the emergence of an awareness of dialectics in the mind of the observer. But the Anthropocene is a condition of anxiety. It is a human problem fundamentally in the psyche and can only be treated by all of us getting on the couch and working through the psychoanalytic trauma of realizing that we are driving this train and we have no idea how to control it. And once you realize that, you can get your hands back on the levers to produce the rambunctious gardens that you desire instead of the ugly, hideous ones that will happen by accident or lack of design. Thank you.